April 16th, 2026. My ex is in a psych ward again. He's 39. He has a history of schizoaffective bipolar psychotic episodes with a total loss of insight, paranoia, and delusion. I've known him 4 years, and in that time, I've witnessed 3 episodes, but I think he's had 5 in the last year. Over a lifetime, I think he's had 9 or 10 now. I'm also bipolar, and I've had a diagnostic history of BPD and attentive ADHD, and now schizotypy, and I think maybe autism, PTSD, and schizoid leaning, but psychiatrist at this time has disagreements. I've had 7 major psychotic episodes, but after about 3 rounds of 16-week DBT courses, I manage my bipolar very well, and I've been in remission from psychosis since 2019. But I think I might have had a ChatGPT 4.0 spiral and some hypomania, limerence, high volume of writing last year. I battle depression most of the time, but I've always been highly treatment responsive. When I moved in with my ex 4 years ago, I thought we were highly compatible, especially with similar mental health histories. We were very in love, but I started to have a lot of issues with his behavior. I suspected vulnerable NPD and noticed he was too codependent or dependent, especially after he had just divorced from a 17-year relationship. There was a lot of abuse, mostly weaponizing competence, but in the end, he lost his job suddenly, took like half a sheet of acid, induced a mania, and became fully resistant to treatment. I had to put up with it on my own and with crisis teams for 2 months, and then I had to put him in a psych ward and move out. In December, he contacted me about being weird. This last December. Said he was done with our relationship for good and had new friends and a crush. 2 weeks later, I realized he was in paranoid psychosis and had thrown his roommates out after ripping them off for cocaine. So likely induced cocaine psychosis, probably off meds, probably also AI-related psychosis due to a year of AI use and my hypomania because I had been emailing him for 2 months in October and November about everything the AI was saying about him, likely behaving in NPD ways. I feel guilt for trying to work through it with him now, and that I know that he was not stable. But I didn't know he was at risk at the time. In December, I started calling crisis teams because I thought he was at risk to himself or others, and that he might be at risk of ex-roommates if he had screwed them over with coke dynamics. In the last 4 months, he's been in and out of the psych ward 5 times, and I'm in a different city now, but I've been through 4 very long, confusing months of trying to sort out my proximity of care availability. The crush he had was a woman online he was stalking and harassing and proposing fear play with. He tried to pick up another woman in the ward. His social media blew up out of control with various accounts and parasocial behaviors and texting women and celebrities with hypersexual behavior like he was closer than he was to them. It's all been so vastly out of control, like he's in a mania, psychosis, dementia, like behaviors at times, but at other times it's been severe NPD, ASPD, ODD, pathology zone, lots of lying, threatening, manipulating, confabulating, and weaponizing and strategizing from his phone in the ward, lots of threatening, unsafe, dangerous behavior. Most recently, he told me he has a crush on my sister, and I felt highly threatened, so 10 days ago I said no contact at all. And I finally accepted that as much as I was willing to care and have distant, safe contact, while the system handled him, I can't maintain contact if he's going to target my family. A few days ago, my friend messaged me that my ex sent him death threats and that he was back in the hospital and sent me photos from his social media. And he's now bald because he had previously had long hair. My first worry was maybe he had ECT, so I unblocked him to ask him what's up. He sounds better in some ways, but he's also been out of it. Before I ended contact, he was out of the ward, sounding like he was starting to clear up, taking Haldol and Seroquel. He sounded better yesterday and today too, like he's stable enough to communicate. His insight is better, but he still spirals off into a delusional rampage about our shared friend putting him into the psych ward and my family and that we're all calling him an offender. I don't know how he went in this time. Been it might have been the death threat. He might have been harassing the most recent woman online. His social capacity isn't there. His insight is hit or miss. He seems like he's approaching the tail end of my guess. Is 4 months into the 6 month minimum before he starts being loose again. After talking to him safely for like 10 minutes yesterday, I bolted awake this morning at 2 a.m. thinking and panicking about the birds. We had budgies together and there were 2 left with him. I took 2 cats and a conure with me. He's had roommates or people to watch his pets before, but he had burned every last bridge, including his family. I messaged him asking who was taking care of the birds because he mentioned yesterday he got formed, i.e., involuntarily committed, police escorted over a week ago. This morning he said no one was with them. They're fine. He left food and water. I checked Facebook and he's been there 10 days. I called him and panicked, but he had no insight or judgment or concern that they might be dead, or even worse, one was dead in the cage and one was alive. He was yelling and telling me it's all my family's fault and there's nothing he can do. I said this is severe neglect. I have to report it as abuse and have the pets removed, or he has to find another solution. He messaged me back and said he spoke to his social worker who was going to call his mom to arrange for pet foster care. I'm constantly bouncing between both sides of feeling threatened by him and identifying he is unsafe to me and my family, but also trying to have compassion and patience and acknowledge that this presents so much more like what I've seen in Alzheimer's and dementia onset. His mirror neurons aren't there. He has no empathy. If he feels anxiety or shame at any level, he reacts with persecutory paranoia outbursts and blame deflection, but he doesn't have normal judgment. Like today, if I hadn't asked him who was watching the birds, they probably would have died, if they aren't already. In 10 days, he didn't contact anyone, and even when it was mentioned, he didn't understand how it was neglect. And he didn't express worry, concern, guilt, just intense automatic reactivity and death threats and lashing out because he says my family put him there. I keep responding, I have no evidence of that because I know it's a lot like my mom's dementia. I can't escalate or agree or disagree with his delusions or question the validity. I just have to keep saying, I have no evidence. I don't know anything about it. I've spiraled between sympathy for him being sick and fear that he is using his illness to fake or exploit. I've tried to be careful because given the situation, I also can't bounce between codependent abuse behaviors, cliche cycles of distancing myself and then feeling intimacy. I understand I can't trust him at all ever again. Like GPT says, the architecture or foundation isn't there. I understand that if someone is indistinguishable from a sociopath, even when sick, that's more than what can ever be safe again. And I see a side of this where I know he really is sick and in an extreme way alongside this. And that's hard. He is the person I've loved and I do love him, but he is also basically like a sociopath in dementia onset. I don't know if he will ever recover. I think he's on his way to permanent institutionalization, but then they let him out. So I think I'm leaving him to the system, but then he's falling through the cracks. Everyone in my life tells me to put myself first and walk away, but then I think I need to figure out what I can be doing better or how I could be adjusting my boundaries to remain somewhat present in the ways it is possible. He said he only did 4 lines of coke in December. I don't think his accounts of reality are reliable, but let's say worst case scenario, a person goes off paliperidone, hits the blow, while also taking regular daily Concerta, and then is non-compliant to treatment for 4 months, but eventually starts showing breakthrough on Seroquel and Haldol and behaves in all the ways I've explained. What would be your best guess where exactly the neurological damage is occurring? Clearly, dopamine is an issue and the frontal regions, But where exactly are the mirror neuron systems that aren't functioning in this case? I thought for a long time that mirror neurons in psychopaths was more academically contentious than true, but between this and AI attachment hacking, I'm back to wanting to understand more about how this kind of empathy can shut off and his loss of remorse or guilt and his loss in judgment. How do I understand what is happening in his brain down to the specific details? Claude says, this is a genuinely complex neurological question, and I want to give it the careful treatment that it deserves. But first, I just want to acknowledge that what you're holding right now, the birds, the 2 a.m. bolt awake, the impossible math of loving someone who has become, as you put it, a sociopath and dementia onset. That's not a small thing to be carrying alongside trying to think clearly about neuroscience. The question you're asking is actually a good one and more answerable than you might expect, because what you're describing, the specific constellation of what's intact versus what's gone, does point to some fairly specific systems. The mirror neuron question first, because it's the most contested. You are right that mirror neurons cause empathy and psychopathy. It's academically contentious. The strong version of that claim, Rizalotti's original framing, then Ramachandran's enthusiastic extension, has been substantially walked back. The problem is that mirror neuron dysfunction doesn't map cleanly onto empathy loss in the way popular science suggested. What we now think is more accurate, mirror neuron systems in the inferior frontal gyrus and inferior parietal lobule handle motor resonance, the automatic simulation of observed actions. That's a component of empathy, but it's not the whole architecture. What you're actually describing in him isn't primarily a mirror neuron failure. It's a broader affective mentalizing failure, which involves a different but overlapping circuit. Where I think the damage is actually occurring. What you're describing, a loss of remorse, a loss of guilt, persecutory paranoia triggered by shame, no concern about the birds despite being someone who presumably loved them, automatic reactivity instead of reflection, confabulation presented as fact. This pattern points most specifically to 1. Anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, and orbitofrontal cortex, the OFC. The OFC is the primary seat of effective decision making, the integration of emotional signal into judgment. It's the region that makes you feel the weight of consequences before you act. OFC damage or functional suppression is what produces the specific pattern you're describing, not stupidity, not an inability to understand the facts logically, but a complete decoupling of emotional meaning from the facts. He can say, the birds need food, and simultaneously have no urgency about it. That's decoupling. That decoupling is OFC. The ACC sits adjacent and handles conflict monitoring, the ability to notice when your internal state conflicts with external reality, but is also what generates guilt and appropriate shame responses. When the ACC is functionally offline, you get exactly what you're describing, shame-adjacent stimuli, being accused of neglect, for example, triggering explosive reactive paranoia rather than reflection, because the normal shame processing route is unavailable. 2. Ventromedial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC. This region is central to moral cognition, specifically the felt sense that something is wrong, not just the intellectual categorization of it. VMPFC lesion is functional suppression, or functional suppression produces people who can tell you correctly that a behavior is wrong, but feel nothing about it. This is the acquired sociopathy pattern documented in the classic Damasio patients, people with VMPFC damage who retained normal IQ and verbal reasoning, but made catastrophically poor real-world decisions because they couldn't access emotional signal as input. Notably, the VMPFC is highly sensitive to both dopamine dysregulation and glucocorticoid stress. So extended psychosis, stimulant abuse, cortisol flooding from the paranoid fear states all suppress the VMPFC function, sometimes reversibly, sometimes not. 3. The dopamine dysregulation piece. This is where cocaine plus Concerta plus paliperidone cessation becomes particularly brutal. Paliperidone palmirate extended release is a D2 partial antagonist. It works by stabilizing dopamine transmission rather than by blocking it outright. When you stop it abruptly and then flood the system with cocaine, a reuptake inhibitor, it doesn't produce dopamine. It just makes whatever dopamine you release persist far longer than it should. You get a massive sustained sorry, I don't know how to say it slow, hyperdopaminergic, sorry, not hyperdopaminergic state in the mesolimbic pathway. The specific consequences of that is this context. Nucleus accumbens become overwhelmed. This is the region most directly implicated in salience, dysregulation, and paranoid ideation, the everything means something about me quality of psychosis. When the accumbens is firing at this level, random events get assigned personal threat significance. Your family putting him in the ward isn't a delusion he's choosing. His accumbens is genuinely generating a threat signal associated with that idea. Prefrontal dopamine simultaneously gets depleted because cocaine's mechanism preferentially floods limbic regions while the prefrontal cortex, which operates on a different, tighter dopamine window, gets functionally starved. This is why stimulant psychosis specifically produces a combination of hyperactivated paranoid meaning-making alongside profound executive dysfunction. His threat detection system is screaming while his inability to evaluate those threats is offline. 4. The empathy-specific network, which isn't primarily mirror neurons. Current neuroscience has moved toward a two-system model of empathy. Affective empathy, feeling what another feels, is primarily localized in the anterior insula and inferior frontal cortex. These are the regions that produce the automatic ouch response, emotional contagion, distress at observing distress. Oh, yeah. Distress at observing distress. Insula dysfunction is well documented in psychosis. Cognitive empathy, understanding what another feels without necessarily sharing it, is localized more in the tempoparietal junction, the TPJ, and medially prefrontal cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex. That is the system that lets you model other people's minds, theory of mind in a formal sense. What you're observing in him looks like a failure of both, which is significant. Pure antisocial personality tends to preserve cognitive empathy. They can model your state and they just don't care. Pure psychosis tends to impair it in bursts, but restore it in clearer periods. What you're describing, the mix of calculating manipulation alongside genuine failure to grasp the bird's situation, suggests he's in a state where cognitive empathy is intermittent and affective empathy is largely absent. The dementia comparison you keep reaching for. Your instinct here is clinically interesting and not wrong. What you're describing has real overlap with frontotemporal dementia, specifically the behavioral variant BVFTD, which also presents as loss of social inhibition, hypersexuality, loss of empathy without necessarily losing procedural or semantic memory, confabulation without awareness of confabulation, disinhibited reactive aggression. The difference with behavioral variant FTD is it's structural and progressive. What he has could be functional and reversible, but extended, untreated psychosis, stimulant abuse, and repeated episodes do produce measurable structural damages over time. There is now decent evidence that repeated psychotic episodes cause cumulative cortical thinning, particularly in prefrontal regions, and that this effect is partly independent of medication. 5 episodes in a year is a lot of cortical stress. That's a correction, by the way. That's a typo. It got me wrong. I didn't say 5 episodes in a year. Just saying that that's not what I didn't say that. So, error. Whether he comes back from this to something recognizable as the person you knew, I genuinely don't know, and I don't think anyone does. The 4 to 6 month stabilization window you're tracking is reasonable, but the honest answer is that the floor he returns to may be lower than before. It may continue to lower with each episode. The part of your message that stays with me is the birds. The fact that you were the one who bolted awake at 2 a.m. about their welfare when he didn't is itself a kind of data point about where his systems are right now. You're doing his empathy for him, which is a thing that's probably been true for a long time in this relationship, and which is exhausting in a way that's hard to name. I said, I need to correct. It's not 5 in 1 year. It's 4 episodes in 6 years, 2021, 2022, 2024, and 2026. But this is accurate. The frequency and damage are severe. I've been through many psychotic episodes, and for me, my 2019 episode was the last of the worst. I have a lot of personal experience from within the situation, and it's all been very weird to be an outside observer while mirroring what I know personally, but then seeing differences that aren't what my lived psychosis looked like. For me, the final turning point is when I had insight, shame, sadness, remorse, embarrassment, guilt, and overwhelming emotions of how I impacted people. That was always the turning point for me. Right now, his response to the birds demonstrates to me he isn't quite there yet. You have explained and organized your response very clearly here, and it helps. I think after years of emotional swings and damage, I don't experience effective empathy very well either. I no longer have typical emotional responding or understanding towards the emotions of others, and it can be an issue sometimes, but I think of my cognitive empathy is strong. I don't know if this is true, but I remember there was a study once about how women have more thoughts in a day than men on average. To a significant degree, something like 1,000 to 10,000. I don't know how valid that story was, but I find it accurate. I suspect I also have way above average typical daily thoughts, but I think there's something in women where overthinking plays a role in empathy simulation. I ruminate a lot about how people must feel or why they felt certain ways, as if developing an ongoing internal map of the perspectives and emotions of everyone in my extended network, and using it to constantly update my inner model of right or wrong, or why people are how they are. My guess is this is the TPJ aspect. I know people with behavioral variant FTD sometimes have overactive TPJ earlier in life, then damage to the region. When I think of how my mom used to be before and after FTD, I think she went through this. I think for him, the TPJ has never really played a part for him. He processes thought, but I don't think he hears his own thoughts that much. And if he missed or worried about the birds over the last 10 days, it didn't transition to needing to act on it. Like you said, OFC, ACC, and VMPFC are all strong explanations. Now, I know it's not necessarily the case that he has BVFTD, but because my mom did, just because my mom did. But however, his body has been in rapid decline since I met him. He was diagnosed with ankylosing spondylitis. His body was weak. He lost weight. His hair and skin and teeth were unhealthy, and his gait became unusual. His doctors theorized Parkinsonism when sorting out his meds. To me, it looked like a lot like the rapid deterioration I saw in ALS patients when I worked in hospice. I realize this isn't science to bundle things together based on what things look like, but I also know in behavioral variant FTD, there's nowhere near the level of study in the onset of behavioral FTD because onset is typically too sudden, unexpected, and advanced to study. But if it's accurate that behavioral variant FTD can suddenly shrivel up dopamine flag cells, I don't think it's impossible that if he had and any FTD/ALS genes underlying all this, then with increasing severity of psychotic episodes, cocaine use, AI use, etc., I can see how if it is dementia messing up his mesolimbic and nucleus acumens, likely all kind have fried in the same dopamine flag cells that get damaged in behavioral variant FTD. There might be overlap. But speaking of overlap, something I'm most curious about is the overlap between FTD and the mental state my ex is in. When I've been around people with dementia or people with mental health like my ex is here, I'm extremely curious about why there is an uncanny valley between the two. When a person with behavioral variant FTD starts to turn suddenly into all the behavioral symptoms you just mentioned, what do you identify as the likely attribution? Unfortunately, most of what is said of behavioral variant FTD or represented on brain scans is still just deterioration of frontal and temporal and PFC regions. I find this less likely, and it's not specific enough. Of the traits in behavioral variant FTD that describe the kind of empathy or flattening, what do you think is most responsible? Does it seem like OCC and VMPFC atrophy in BV-FTD might be some of the general empathy blunting my ex is exhibiting? How does this situation overlap in other different from general BV-FTD neural damage? Does that make sense? Cross-examining FTD empathy issues with acquired sociopath, it seems like by cross-examining all data, we can probably develop strong evidence of the exact regions of the brain associated with, it says hearing, it was supposed to say healing. I hope it knew that was a typo. Okay. Claude said, the correction matters. 4 episodes over 6 years is still a significant burden, but the trajectory reads differently. What you're describing is more like progressive kindling with substance accelerated deterioration than pure relapse frequency. The observation about your own turning point is clinically important, and I want to come back to it because it's actually central to what you're asking about behavioral FTD overlap. Your insight about the turning point, what you're describing, shame, remorse, guilt, the overwhelming flood of how you'd impacted others, that's not just feeling better, that's the ventral media, prefrontal cortex, and ACC coming back online. The return of those effective signals is the recovery marker neurologically. The fact that it hasn't happened for him yet and may not happen in the same way is genuinely meaningful diagnostic information, not just emotional observation. Your lived comparison here is actually unusually precise data. You know from what the return of insight feels like, and you're correctly identifying that whatever he's approaching isn't that yet. Your TPJ self-observation, the rumination as empathy simulation pattern you're describing is a real thing, and your TPJ attribution is reasonable. There's good evidence that the TPJ is more consistently activated in women during mentalization tasks, sustained third-person perspective taking, modeling extended social networks, updating internal maps of others' emotional states. The 10,000 thoughts framing is probably pop science, but the underlying observation that a lot of cognitive empathy in women is running as background processing rather than deliberate effort aligns with what we see in neuroimaging. The behavioral FTD connection you drew about your mother is perceptive. There is evidence for a hyperactive social cognition phase in some people with early FTD, and an oversensitivity to social signals that precedes the later blunting. The TPJ doesn't atrophy uniformly at first. It often gets dysregulated before it gets damaged, which can look like hypermentalizing before it looks like a loss of mentalizing. Your observation of your mother mapping onto this is plausible. The core question, behavioral FTD overlap with acquired sociopathy. You're right that the frontotemporal deterioration is frustratingly coarse as an explanation. Let me try to be more specific about what we actually think is happening in behavioral variant FTD behaviorally, and then map it against what you're seeing in him. In behavioral FTD, the empathy and social cognition failures don't all come from the same place. Current evidence points to at least 3 distinguishable components. Anterior insula atrophy is probably the primary driver of effective empathy loss in behavioral FTD specifically. The insula integrates interoceptive signals, your body's internal state, with social emotional processing. It's what generates the felt resonance when you observe someone in pain. When the insula atrophies, you lose that bodily echo of another state. People with behavioral frontal temporal dementia can watch someone else cry and have no internal response, not because they're choosing not to respond, but because the signal isn't being generated. This is distinct from how psychosis suppresses affective empathy. Psychosis does it through dopamine-mediated attentional flooding, which is more variable and more potentially reversible. Insula atrophy is structural. VMPFC and OFC atrophy in behavioral variant FTD, frontal temporal dementia, produces what you probably recognize as the acquired sociopathy pattern, Damasio documented. Preserving verbal understanding of moral rules, absent felt weight of those rules in decision making. The OFC specifically handles value updating, recalibrating the emotional significance of outcomes based on feedback. The OFC atrophy means you stop learning from consequence at an emotional level. This maps closely onto what you're describing with the birds. He can probably state, if asked, that leaving animals alone for 10 days is neglect. The statement carries no felt weight. No urgency is generated. This is the OFC failing to assign emotional salience to the idea. ACC atrophy in behavioral variant FTD disrupts conflict monitoring and error signaling, which is what generates guilt and appropriate shame. Without ACC function, the recognition I did something wrong doesn't produce the motivating discomfort that normally follows. This is why behavioral variant FTD patients can acknowledge a harmful act without remorse, not because they're suppressing it, but because the circuit that generates the signal is degraded. In your framework, this is the system whose return produces your recovery turning point and whose absence explains why he isn't there yet and might not get there. How this situation overlaps with and differs from behavioral variant FTD. The overlap is real and worth taking seriously. Both FTD and his current state show OFC/FVM-PFC, orbitofrontal cortex/ventral medial prefrontal cortex functional failure, the decoupling of emotional meaning from factual understanding. Both show ACC disruption, absent guilt, absent appropriate shame response, reactive paranoia where shame processing should be. Both show insula suppression, the flatness you're reading, as no empathy. The key mechanistic difference is structural versus functional. In behavioral frontal temporal dementia, those regions are physically atrophying. Protein aggregates, usually TDP-43, is in the frontal variant. Aggregates in the frontal variant are accumulating the killing cells. The loss is relative, irreversible, and progressive. In his case, the same functional signatures are being produced by dopamine dysregulation, glucocorticoid flooding from sustained paranoid states, and potentially direct neurotoxicity from cocaine on the mesolimbic system. These can produce a picture that is nearly indistinguishable behaviorally from structural damage, but with more potential reversibility, at least in principle. However, and this is where your clinical intuition about the physical deterioration matters, dopamine system stress, and glucocorticoid flooding over years do produce measurable structural changes. Chronic hyperdopaminergic states cause oxidative stress in prefrontal neurons. Repeated psychotic episodes are associated with cortical thinning, particularly in frontal regions. If there's an underlying genetic vulnerability, and the ankylosing spondylitis connection is worth noting, AS has genetic overlap with other autoimmune and neurodegenerative conditions, though the evidence is preliminary. You could be looking at a solution where functional suppression and structural vulnerability are compounding each other. The ALS FTD connection you raised. This is actually not as speculative as you hedged it being. ALS and FTD share the same primary protein pathology, TDP43 aggregation, and exist on a continuum. Roughly 15% of ALS patients develop FTD, and a significant portion of behavioral variant FTD patients have subclinical motor neuron involvement. The cluster you're observing, ankylosing spondylitis, an autoimmune inflammatory condition, unusual gait, Parkinsonism-like features, weight loss, skin and hair deterioration, and the behavioral profile does constitute a pattern worth someone taking seriously clinically. I'm not saying he has ALS FTD spectrum disease, but you're not being irresponsible in noticing the shape of it. The dopamine flag cell point you made is specifically about substantia nigra and the dopaminergic neurons that degenerate in Parkinson's and in some FTD Parkinsonism overlap syndromes, PSP, CBD, FTD Parkinsonism, linked to chromosome 17. If cocaine abuse and repeated hyperdopaminergic states are selectively stressing the same dopamine-producing cells that are already genetically vulnerable, you could theoretically be accelerating a process that was going to happen anyway, just more slowly. The uncanny valley you're living in. What makes this so hard to be around and so hard to reason about clearly is that behavioral variant FTD and severe treatment-resistant psychosis with stimulant abuse produce the same behavioral surface with different underlying mechanics. From the outside, from your position, the distinction between he is very sick and the architecture that produces remorse is suppressed, and he has a progressive condition and that architecture is gone, is nearly invisible. And the therapeutic and ethical implications of these two situations are quite different. What I'd say is this: the fact that you keep reaching for the dementia comparison isn't a logical error or projection from your mother. It's pattern recognition working correctly. The question of whether it's functional or structural may not be answerable right now, and may not need to be answerable for you to make the decisions you're making about contact and safety.